Night Court brought laughter to late-night TV with a courtroom full of quirky characters and chaotic charm. But behind the scenes, many cast members faced heartbreaking struggles from sudden deaths and long illnesses to years of quiet loneliness. Today we look back at the real stories behind the laughter and honor the unforgettable stars who made this show a classic. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Court is now in session. Let's begin. Charles Robinson as Mac Robinson. Charles P. Robinson, born on November 9, 1945 in Houston, Texas, joined Night Court in its second season in 1984 at the age of 38. As Mac Robinson, the easygoing, cardigan-wearing court clerk Charles brought warmth, quiet strength, and a calm center to the show's whirlwind of bizarre defendants and eccentric colleagues. Mac was the soul of reason in a world of chaos, and Charles played him with a natural grace that audiences instantly embraced. But behind the scenes, Robinson's own life was shaped by years of quiet struggle, perseverance, and deep personal wounds that rarely made headlines. Before fame. Charles served in the Army and then toured with a doo-wop group, Archie Bell and the Drells, chasing a dream that often left him broke and homesick. He turned to acting not for glory but survival, and worked tirelessly in theater and television for over a decade before Night Court finally gave him a spotlight. Though beloved by fans, Charles remained underappreciated in the industry. He never landed the lead roles he deserved, often typecast or overlooked. But he never complained. Instead, he poured his soul into each performance on stage, on screen, and even off-camera, where colleagues described him as kind, humble, and always the first to offer help. His personal life was equally modest. Charles was married to actress Dolorita Noonan for over 35 years, raising children and stepchildren in a quiet home far from Hollywood's spotlight. But in his final years, health troubles began to mount. After battling cancer for several years in silence, he was admitted to the hospital in June 2021 with complications from metastatic adenocarcinoma, a rare and aggressive cancer. Charles Robinson passed away on July 11, 2021 at the age of 75. His death stunned the Night Court fan community, many of whom never knew he had been ill. His legacy lives on not in headlines but in the steady, soulful presence he brought to every scene. At the time of his passing, his net worth was estimated at around $4 million, built not from blockbuster films or endorsements, but from decades of quiet, honest work. He may have played a supporting role in the courtroom, but in the hearts of fans, Charles Robinson was the moral compass of Night Court and always will be. Harry Anderson as Judge Harry Stone. Harry Laverne. Anderson, born on October 14, 1952 in Newport, Rhode Island, became the quirky heartbeat of Night Court as Judge Harry T. Stone, the young jazz-loving, magic-performing judge who ruled his courtroom with wit, compassion, and a childlike sense of wonder. When Night Court debuted in 1984, Harry was just 31 years old, a fresh face with an offbeat charm that made him instantly unforgettable. Audiences loved him, not just for the jokes and card tricks, but for the rare warmth he brought to primetime television. Yet behind the curtain of laughter and levity, Harry Anderson lived a life far more complex, marked by quiet heartbreak, sudden fame, and a lonely final chapter few saw coming. Before stardom, Harry was a street magician in San Francisco and New Orleans, performing sleight of hand for spare change. Comedy clubs gave him his first taste of the spotlight, and by the late 1970s, he had become a regular on Saturday Night Live and Cheers. But Night Court was his breakthrough, and with it came intense pressure. Harry struggled with the demands of sudden fame. Though he smiled on screen off camera, he often felt like an outsider in Hollywood, a magician playing an actor. He turned down many big offers after Night Court, including roles that could have made him a household name simply because he didn't trust the industry. He once said, "I never wanted to be an actor. I just wanted to do magic and make people laugh." After Night Court ended in 1992, he retreated from the spotlight, moving to New Orleans to open a magic shop and nightclub called Spade and Archer. But Hurricane Katrina destroyed much of what he had built. Devastated, he and his second wife, Elizabeth, relocated to Asheville, North Carolina, where Harry largely disappeared from public view. In his final years, he battled multiple health issues, including influenza and a series of strokes. He rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared in public, and quietly wrestled with depression. On April 16, 2018, Harry Anderson was found dead in his home at the age of 65. The cause was listed as a stroke, complicated by influenza and heart disease. His death shocked fans not because of its drama, but because it came with no warning, no farewell, no final performance, just silence. Richard Maul as Bull Shannon. Charles Richard Maul, born on January 13, 1943 in Pasadena, California, became one of television's most iconic gentle giants as Bull Shannon, the towering, bald-headed bailiff with a heart of gold and a mind full of surprises. With his deep voice, towering 6'8" frame, and perfectly timed one-liners, Richard Maul turned Bull into Night Court's most lovable oddball. When the show launched in 1984, Richard was 41 years old, a character actor with a distinctive look and booming presence, who had often been cast as villains, monsters, and henchmen. But Night Court changed everything. As Bull, he wasn't scary, he was sincere, childlike, endearingly weird, and viewers adored him for it. But behind Bull's slow grin and goofy charm was a man who wrestled with isolation typecasting and years of being misunderstood both in the industry and in his personal life. Richard was often pigeonholed because of his height and voice playing roles that required physical intimidation rather than emotional depth. Even after Night Court's success, he found it difficult to land parts that allowed him to show range. He voiced animated villains, appeared in B-movies, and took on cameo roles that rarely lived up to his talent. Though always working, he often felt like he was just a piece of furniture on screen, memorable but not essential. Privately, Richard lived a quiet and solitary life. He married once to Susan Brown in 1993, but the marriage ended in divorce after only 5 years. They had 2 children, whom he remained close to, but Richard never remarried. In later interviews, he confessed to feeling lonely in the years after Night Court, describing Hollywood as a place that remembers your look, but not your soul. In his final decades, Richard retreated from the spotlight. He moved to Big Bear Lake, California, where he focused on painting, sculpting, and spending time outdoors far from the Hollywood cameras that once followed him. He occasionally lent his voice to cartoons and video games, but his towering physical presence, once his calling card, was now his quiet burden. On October 26, 2023, Richard Maul passed away peacefully at his home in Big Bear Lake. He was 80 years old. The news shocked fans who had not seen him in years but still remembered every ooh-kay and every bull moment with a smile. Markie Post as Christine Sullivan. Marjorie Markie Post, born on November 4, 1950 in Palo Alto, California, became the radiant heart of Night Court as public defender Christine Sullivan, a smart, compassionate, and occasionally flustered attorney who balanced sharp legal wit with endearing vulnerability. When she joined the cast in 1985 at 34 years old, Markie Post brought a fresh dynamic to the courtroom. With her bright eyes, impeccable comedic timing, and a sincerity that never felt scripted, she became an instant fan favorite. Christine wasn't just the pretty face in the room, she was the moral compass, the emotional anchor, and often the only sane voice in a sea of absurdity. But behind the laughter and charisma was a woman who spent decades fighting quietly for roles, for dignity, and later, for her life. Markie came from an academic family. Her father was a physicist, but chose a different path, working behind the scenes on game shows like Double Dare before pursuing acting full-time. Early on, she faced rejection after rejection, with producers often labeling her too wholesome or not edgy enough. Yet she never gave up. Her breakthrough came with The Fall Guy before Night Court catapulted her into stardom. But as quickly as the spotlight came, it began to dim. Despite her obvious talent, Markie was often boxed into roles that relied on her looks more than her depth. She longed to play darker, more complex women, but the offers rarely came. Off-screen, Markie lived a stable, loving life with her husband, writer Michael A. Ross. They had 2 daughters and built a home far removed from the chaos of Hollywood. Friends described her as fiercely loyal, funny, and incredibly down-to-earth, someone who cared more about showing up for her kids' school plays than red carpets. In 2017, Markey was diagnosed with cancer, a battle she kept mostly private. For nearly 4 years, she endured chemotherapy and surgeries while continuing to work whenever possible. Her final roles were voice appearances and small cameos, quiet goodbyes that fans didn't realize were goodbyes at all. On August 7, 2021, Markey Post passed away at her Los Angeles home surrounded by family. She was 70 years old. Her death hit especially hard not only because of her warmth on screen, but because she had fought so bravely for so long without ever asking for pity. Selma Diamond as Selma Hacker. Selma Diamond, born on August 6, 1920, in London, Ontario. Canada lit up Night Court as bailiff, Selma Hacker, a deadpan, chain-smoking, razor-sharp woman with a gravelly voice and a wit that could slice through steel. When Night Court premiered in 1984, Selma was 63 years old, and though her time on the show was short, her impact was unforgettable. A veteran comedy writer before becoming an actress, Selma was never meant to be in front of the camera, she was the voice behind it. In the 1950s and 60s, she shattered glass ceilings in writers' rooms, filled almost entirely with men penning jokes for legends like Sid Caesar Milton Berle and Perry Como. Her sharp tongue and New York sarcasm earned her respect in an era when few women could command a seat at the comedy table. But despite her talent, Selma constantly faced discrimination. Producers dismissed her as too brash, too old, or simply not camera material. It wasn't until late in life, after years of ghostwriting and voiceover work, that she was finally offered on-screen roles. And then came Night Court. As bailiff Selma Hacker, she didn't need a punchline. Her every glance was the punchline. She played the aging courtroom veteran with a cigarette in hand, a lifetime of stories in her eyes, and a one-liner always on the tip of her tongue. Behind that character was a woman who had lived it all, the heartbreak, the loneliness, and the grit it took to survive decades in show business without ever fully being embraced. Selma had been a heavy smoker for most of her life, and by the time she landed Night Court, her health was already in decline. She was diagnosed with lung cancer during the show's first season, but insisted on continuing to work, refusing to let illness rob her of her long-overdue spotlight. She completed 22 episodes before the cancer became too aggressive. Selma Diamond passed away on May 13, 1985, at the age of 64, just 1 year after Night Court brought her into America's living rooms. Her death devastated the cast and crew, and her character was never recast in spirit. Instead, she was honored by legacy, and later tributes, including Marsha Warfield, carried her torch. Florence Halop as Florence Kleiner. Florence Halop, born on January 23, 1923 in Queens, New York, stepped into Night Court with a spark of attitude and a heart full of grit. She joined the show in 1985 as bailiff Florence Kleiner, replacing the beloved Selma Diamond after her tragic passing. Like Selma, Florence brought her own sharp wit and weathered charm to the courtroom, not as a copy, but as a force of her own. At 62 years old, Florence had spent decades in the industry by the time she donned the bailiff's badge. Her career began in radio during the 1930s, performing as a child actress. She later became a television regular in the 1950s and 60s, often cast as nosy neighbors, cranky aunts, and world-weary women with a heart buried beneath sarcasm. Her most recognizable role before Night Court was on St. Elsewhere, where she played another chain-smoking, no-nonsense patient. Off-screen Florence was described as fiercely independent, deeply private, and endlessly professional. She never chased fame, she chased good work. And after a lifetime of character roles, Night Court gave her one of the most memorable moments of her career. As Florence Kleiner, she brought a dry delivery, knowing glances, and comic timing that felt effortless. Audiences connected with her immediately, and she helped carry the torch after Selma's death with grace and humor. But fate would deal Night Court a second cruel blow. Shortly after joining the cast, Florence was diagnosed with lung cancer, just like her predecessor. A lifelong smoker, she had long suffered from respiratory issues but never let it stop her from performing. Determined not to leave the show unfinished, she kept filming despite her illness, hiding her pain behind laughter, showing up to set with determination and strength that inspired the entire crew. Sadly, her condition worsened rapidly. On July 15, 1986, less than a year after she joined Night Court, Florence Halop passed away at 63 years old. For the second time in just over a year, the show and the world lost a powerful woman who had found her voice late in life, only to be silenced too soon. Her death devastated the cast and marked a turning point in the show's tone. The writers paid tribute to her legacy by allowing her character to exit with dignity never forgotten, never replaced in spirit. The role of bailiff would eventually be filled by Marsha Warfield, but the weight of Florence's brief presence remained. Paula Kelly as Liz Williams. Paula Kelly, born on October 21, 1942, in Jacksonville, Florida, brought elegance, intelligence, and strength to Night Court as public defender Liz Williams in the show's very first season. At 42 years old, she was already a seasoned performer, a Broadway sensation, a film actress, and a classically trained dancer whose presence lit up every room she entered. When Night Court premiered in 1984, Paula played Liz with a rare blend of poise and sharp humor. She was the show's first female public defender, graceful yet assertive, holding her own amid the absurdity of late-night court chaos. Though she only appeared in 10 episodes, her performance made a lasting impact, earning her an Emmy nomination and helping shape the tone of what the show would become. But Paula Kelly's journey was never just about television. She was a trailblazer. A graduate of Juilliard, she made her name as a dancer on Broadway, sharing the stage with legends like Sammy Davis Jr. and Gene Kelly. She later transitioned to film, starring in critically acclaimed projects like Sweet Charity Soylent Green and The Women of Brewster Place. She portrayed black women with intelligence, sensuality, and dignity, refusing to be boxed in by the industry's limited expectations. Still behind the spotlight, Paula lived a private, often quiet life. She was intensely focused on her craft, but wary of fame's spotlight. She married British director Don Chaffee in the 1980s and had one daughter, though she rarely spoke about her family in public. Friends described her as disciplined, deeply spiritual, and quietly fierce. A woman who chose her roles carefully and carried herself with unshakable grace. After her brief time on Night Court, she stepped back from television, focusing on stage, work, teaching, and private life. Hollywood never quite knew what to do with someone as multi-talented and deeply principled as Paula Kelly. But she never needed validation from the industry. She had already made her mark. In her final years, she battled chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, a long, difficult illness that eventually took her life. On February 8, 2020, Paula Kelly passed away in Los Angeles at the age of 77. Her death came quietly with little media attention, but for those who knew her work, it was a profound loss. Mel Tormet as himself. Mel Tormet, born on September 13, 1925 in Chicago, Illinois, wasn't just a jazz legend. He was Judge Harry Stone's idol obsession and musical soul in Night Court. Playing himself in multiple guest appearances throughout the show's run, Tormet became a recurring symbol of magic, nostalgia, and the emotional core of Harry Anderson's quirky character. Known as the Velvet Fog, for his smooth, mellow voice, Mel Tormet had been a household name in the music world long before Night Court. A prodigious talent, he wrote the Christmas song Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire when he was just 19 years old, and spent decades performing with jazz greats like Buddy Rich and George Shearing. But what made his appearances on Night Court so touching wasn't just the music, it was the unspoken kinship between performer and fan. Judge Stone's childlike joy whenever Tormet appeared, whether singing in court or just passing through, mirrored Harry Anderson's real-life admiration for the crooner. Their scenes together blurred the lines between fiction and reality, elevating Tormet's cameo roles into deeply personal moments for the show's fans. He wasn't just a guest star, he was part of Night Court's emotional DNA. Off-screen, Mel Tormet led a life of brilliance but also of struggle. He married 4 times and had 5 children, but confessed to being a workaholic who often chose the stage over home. Though widely respected as a jazz innovator and writer, Tormet felt underappreciated in a pop-driven music industry that often passed him by. In 1996, his health took a devastating turn. He suffered a severe stroke that left him unable to perform, silencing the voice that had enchanted audiences for over 60 years. For the next 3 years, he lived in quiet decline, unable to return to the stage that had defined his existence. His family shielded him from the press, protecting his dignity as the music world slowly began to mourn. On June 5, 1999, Mel Tormet passed away at the age of 73 in Los Angeles. His death marked the end of an era not just for jazz, but for the warm-hearted, whimsical tone he helped bring to Night Court. Harry Anderson later called him a dream come true, saying that working with Tormet was one of the greatest joys of his life. At the time of his death, Mel Tormet's net worth was estimated at $10 million, built over decades of performances, recordings, and songwriting royalties. But no amount could measure what he gave emotionally to audiences, to music lovers, and to a sitcom that used jazz as a bridge between humor and heart. Jack Riley as Beepo the Clown. Jack Riley, born on December 30, 1935 in Cleveland, Ohio, wasn't a mainstay of Night Court, but his guest appearances on the show brought the same nervous energy and quirky charm that made him one of television's most beloved everyman character actors. With his lanky frame, anxious expressions, and dry delivery, Riley fits seamlessly into the absurd world of the Manhattan courtroom, often portraying neurotic or uptight defendants caught in bizarre situations. But while his Night Court roles were brief, they reflected a career built on turning insecurity into art and making millions laugh in the process. Riley rose to fame as the perpetually miserable Elliot Carlin on The Bob Newhart Show in the 1970s, a role that defined him for decades. Carlin was rude, neurotic, and self-absorbed, yet somehow, thanks to Riley's brilliance, also heartbreakingly human. He took a man on the verge of breakdown and made him lovable. And that became Riley's quiet superpower, finding the pain beneath the punchline. Off-screen, Jack Riley was far more reserved than the neurotics he played. A kind, introspective man, he was deeply committed to his wife, Ginger Lawrence, whom he married in 1970. They never had children, but their partnership endured for over 45 years. Friends described him as thoughtful, witty, and far more emotionally grounded than the characters he brought to life. In the 1990s, Riley became famous with a whole new generation as the voice of Stu Pickles, the lovable and often overwhelmed dad on Rugrats. For many, that gentle voice became the sound of childhood proof that even a man who built a career on nervous wrecks could become the emotional anchor of a cartoon family. But behind the scenes, Jack's health began to fail quietly. In his final years, he suffered from pneumonia and complications related to a long battle with illness that was never publicly detailed. He stepped back from the spotlight, choosing to live his last chapter in peace and privacy. On August 19, 2016, Jack Riley passed away in Los Angeles at the age of 80. He died in the arms of the woman he loved, far from the cameras, far from the courtroom chaos, but never far from the hearts of those who remembered his brilliance. John Larette as Dan Fielding. When Night Court premiered in 1984, few could have predicted that a smug, womanizing prosecutor named Dan Fielding would become one of television's most iconic characters. But thanks to John Larette, Dan became much more than a punchline. He became a paradox. Equal parts vulgar and vulnerable, arrogant and insecure Dan Fielding was TV's lovable villain. And John Larette, the man behind him, carried his own share of contradictions off-screen. Born on November 25, 1947, in New Orleans, Louisiana, Larette didn't take the traditional path to stardom. Before acting, he was a jazz saxophonist, a Navy radar technician, and a man wandering through life with little direction. Then in his late 20s, he found theater, and it changed everything. When he joined Night Court at 36 years old, Larette brought something electric to the role of Dan Fielding. Confidence so outrageous, it was almost poetic. He transformed Dan into a force of nature, a man with a libido louder than his moral compass, yet somehow still capable of unexpected depth. Underneath the smirks and sexual innuendos, Larette gave Dan loneliness, regret, even shame, and that made him unforgettable. His performance earned 4 consecutive Emmy Awards from 1985 to 1988. In 1989, he asked not to be submitted again, believing others deserved the spotlight. It was a move as classy as it was rare. But behind the Emmy wins and the fame, John Larette was fighting a much darker battle. Alcoholism had plagued him for years, even before Night Court began. He later revealed that during the early seasons, he was often drunk on set, functioning through scenes in a haze. In 1982, 2 years before Night Court, he hit rock bottom and nearly lost everything. He quit drinking cold turkey. No rehab, no fanfare, just pure will. And from that moment on, he remained sober even as his character lived out every bad impulse he himself had sworn off. It was a surreal duality, playing a man with no brakes while living like a man who had finally found them. Off-screen, Larette found solace in stability. He married his wife, Elizabeth Ann Cookson, in 1975, and they raised 3 children together, far from the tabloids and chaos of Hollywood. He later channeled his pain and recovery into deeper roles in The John Larette Show, Boston Legal, and stage work that earned him a Tony Award. In a full-circle moment, John Larette returned to Night Court in 2023, reprising Dan Fielding in a reboot that introduced the character to a new generation. But this time, Dan was older, wiser, and carrying the weight of his past, just like the man who played him. The performance was hailed as both nostalgic and hauntingly real. As of 2025, John Larette is still with us now in his late 70s, still acting, still sharp, and still sober. His net worth is estimated at $910 million, but his true wealth is in what he overcame and what he gave. They made us laugh when we needed it most. In a courtroom that rarely followed the rules, the cast of Night Court gave us chaos, compassion, and unforgettable characters. But behind the quirky smiles and quick one-liners were real people, many of whom faced illness, heartbreak, and battles the public never saw. Some left us too soon. Others faded quietly from the spotlight. Yet all of them left behind something timeless, a legacy of laughter, heart, and humanity that still resonates with fans decades later. So tonight, as the court adjourns and the lights dim, we remember them not just as actors, but as souls who gave their all on screen and off. Which Night Court moment lives rent-free in your memory? Which character still brings a smile to your face? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Court is adjourned, but their stories live on.